Hello and good evening to everyone, and thank you all for being here in attendance for our newest episode on Let's Talk About. This evening, we will be having a conversation on a very important topic that we know as affirmative action. And what we know is this has been institution that has been in many ways embedded into our country's fabric for several decades. And what we've realized is in the coming months, we know our Supreme Court will be taking two particular cases in reference to higher education. And so we want to make sure we fully understand what the consequences, depending on what that outcome will look like. Joining us today, we have brought in a few experts that we believe will help us learn a little bit more about this topic's history and what this sort of means for us as educators on a higher ed institution. Joining with us today, we have Art Coleman, who is a managing partner and co-founder of the Education Counsel. We have Dr. Julie J. Park, who is an associate professor of education at the University of Maryland. We also have Rachel Spraker, who is the senior director for education and inclusive excellence with the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Virginia. Thank you all so much for being here. We're just going to go ahead and get started in the conversation that we've got here. And I recognize that it's important for us to at least establish some terms and definitions to make sure we're all on the same page here when it comes to this topic. So the first question that I would love to pose for you all here is to really just add some definitions to what affirmative action is, but also in collaboration with that, what has that relationship with affirmative action and the Supreme Court looked like over the last few decades since its conception. Art, we're going to go ahead and start with you to see if you can get us started, and then I'll pass it off to some of the other panelists that are here.
Okay, thanks, Adrian. Thanks for having me. Let me just do a quick snapshot of history to set the stage. This concept of what's popularly known as affirmative action. I've got issues with it being used in the kind of cases we're talking about today, but we can get into that. But basically, this concept originated in 1978, the Bakke decision that many people know about, where the court struck down a quota system at the in a medical school in that case, but where Justice Powell singularly held up the notion that the educational benefits of diversity might support some consideration of race in admission. So even though they struck down the program, Justice Powell, what was essentially considered a compromise opinion, wrote that he thought there was still an open door for some consideration of race in admissions. You fast forward from that 25 years, and you get the Grutter and Gratz decisions in 2003 involving the University of Michigan, where for the first time a full majority of the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed Justice Powell's opinion and said, yes, institutions can consider race in a limited way in admissions if they are advancing the forward-looking education mission-based benefits of diversity, and the design of the program is what the court's term narrowly tailored, just means very precisely refined to serve those particular interests. Then some years later, in 2013 and 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court revisited that doctrine in the application of the principles to a case involving the University of Texas at Austin, Fisher versus the University of Texas. And in that case, ultimately upheld the Grutter-Gratz principles from 2003, affirming Bakke, and affirmed University of Texas's design in its particular facts, advancing the benefits of diversity. And that brings us to today's moment in time, where we've got oral arguments scheduled for Halloween, as it turns out, in the SFFA, Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard and UNC cases that will be considered separately by the court. The plaintiff in that case has pressed fundamentally the challenge to this entire doctrine for 45 years that the court has ruled with great sort of coherence and alignment. they're trying to wipe it out and basically eliminate the consideration of race in admissions.
I'd love to sort of pull in my other two panelists here to see if they can sort of provide some context. In our particular work field in the higher ed sort of frame, what will that essentially look like with, and excuse the ambiance noise that are sort of outside there, but that sort of abrupt change of what the admissions process could look like with the removal of affirmative action. I know we'll get into a few more specifics later on, but what are some of the consequences that could potentially turn into as the years sort of go by without any guardrails to sort of replace what affirmative action sort of brings to a lot of higher institutions?
One thing, and I hope it's okay to step in, and then maybe Julie can pick back up on some of that too, just to actually broaden the frame a little bit if we can, because I think one of the things when Adrian was introducing me that I work on, we are also, as a higher ed institution, an employer. And I think it is just important to think about affirmative action as a public policy tied to non-discrimination that actually, I would say, particularly in employment, actually has some roots that go somewhat further back than what Art suggested, where we're talking about the admissions practices. So I did just want to mention that because it's gone through a number of legal cases and battles and sort of been winnowed away through the 80s and 90s, actually even a bit more so than the case that's been able to sort of stand up with affirmative action as public policy in higher education admissions. So in the employment space, so I would say affirmative action is a public policy. It functions through the lever typically of receiving federal funding. So if that is, I have a federal contract to do research as a higher ed, it comes with some pieces, right, in terms of presidential executive orders that have come down since actually the JFK administration and really the Lyndon Johnson administration. It brings into the conversation hiring, contracting, as well as access to public goods like higher education, which get a lot of federal state funding. So I just want to kind of add into what Art was saying there to broaden our understanding of affirmative action actually as a public policy and where it's coming from, and it has a particular history. As I mentioned, in employment, the legal standards are very different for what it means to do quote unquote affirmative action in employment or contracting, and what it means to do that in the higher education space, as Art talked about. But I think it's in some of those other spaces, we've already seen legal battles sort of go through where this idea of having any reference to race or sex as a thing, as a public policy, it tends to be focused on race, sex, disability, and veteran status. Those have already been sort of cut from their original broader collective and unequal impact to being this much more individualized assessment, which I think is what you see in some of the current cases too. So I think we've already seen some of it go away in certain contexts. I think because of those long-standing battles, we've also seen a lot of alternatives to admissions in states, because I mentioned it's a federal policy. So we've actually already seen states like Michigan, states like California, some others put in public education, quote unquote, bans on affirmative action already that are separate from these particular spaces. So there are some contexts where we're already seeing essentially what admissions look like absent the policy, which I don't know, Julie and others can say more about what that may look like, but I think we also have now a number of years, some of them 20 plus years, of not having those admissions programs where we've seen very significant declines in the representation, particularly of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks.
Yeah, so just to piggyback off of what the other two panelists shared already in response to, I think, Adrian's core question of what will be the impact if sort of overnight or, over one day in the not too distant future, it's announced that race conscious admissions is illegal in higher education. So what sort of impact would we see? And I think the answer is a disastrous and really significant widespread negative impact. As Rachel mentioned, we've seen some of the kind of previews, unfortunately, that have happened in certain states that have already have bans on being able to consider race, ethnicity as one of numerous variables or traits that are taken into account during the admissions process. And so two of the ones that are talked about commonly are California, and then also, in Michigan, also because they have a state ban. And others. And so, it's important to recognize that race conscious admissions isn't a one size fits all model, right? And so, we have people who argue like, oh, there were these simulations where we were able to look at certain institutions. And, if you took out consideration of race and used sort of other metrics, they were still able to have a certain level or comparable racial ethnic diversity. And it's really important to recognize, like, number one, like that it's sort of not always apples to apples, right? What you're seeing or what is underneath kind of those numbers. But number two is it's also important to say, well, that doesn't mean that you can ban consideration of race for the entire country, right? Based off of your study of like one institution that's like 80% white and admits already like 60% of its applicants, right? And so where you would probably see the most immediate impact are kind of, I'd say institutions that have like lower admit rates or kind of are known in the sphere as either like highly selective or, as some might call them, highly rejective. And so there are some estimates that, Harvard in particular, that you could see drops of about 1/3 to even 1/2 among Black and Latinx populations. And, I think the university would try to recuperate some of that through aggressive measures and, investments in outreach and scholarship funding and other things. But I think what California, the case study of California shows us is that, even when an institution is doing pretty much everything in its power at a certain level, their hands are going to be really tied if they're not able to address race, ethnicity in a more direct way. Another consideration is just that, beyond actual like the admission sphere and what that would have in terms of like undergraduates and the types of undergraduate classes institutions are able to enroll. We have research that also points to a certain chilling effects that have happened in states where they're not able to consider race, ethnicity in the admissions process. But that doesn't mean you still can't talk about race, right, in other spheres of campus. And so there's a really, I think, powerful study that was done by Liliana Garces and colleagues where she studied one of these institutions very closely that was affected by a statewide ban and showed how administrators expressed they were very hesitant to touch race with a 10-foot pole, even in things like programming or how to address it in certain ways, because they were just very, they were worried about breaking the law, even though I think they actually had more wiggle room or more freedom than they thought they did. And so I think those are kind of two, one, just directly on admissions, and then number two, more sort of like on the climate and potential impact of how people are able to talk about race. Those are two of the ramifications that I could see.
I'd love to sort of stay here on this topic when it comes to really defining what affirmative action is and how there are a lot of misconceptions on what its sort of purpose is. Julie, if you can sort of share a bit of what are some of these sort of myths that we see about affirmative action. Particularly, there's sort of like a misconception that it sort of represents like a sort of racial reparations to some degree. But when we sort of look at some of the statistics that we see here, it does not always warrant the outcomes that we may be particularly looking for. So for example, a lot of numbers will point to and say, hey, affirmative action actually benefits white middle to lower class women a lot more than maybe some of the other racial demographics. What can you help us sort of make sense out of that? And is there a way to look at this holistically here, if that makes any sense?
Sure. Yeah, there are a lot of myths and misconceptions about what is affirmative action or what is race conscious admissions. A lot of times in the media, I see the term like race-based admissions, which I think feeds a misunderstanding, right? So the public reads that and they're like, oh my goodness, admissions based on race. And so, there's with all of that confusion, there's a lot of, people thinking like, oh, people are getting in because they're XYZ, right? Or people are getting in to fill a quota, or people are getting in, or certain groups aren't getting in because there are ceilings, or there are, Harvard can't have more than this certain percentage of Asian Americans or of whites or of other groups. And we know all of that is really false, right? That's, that is, number one, illegal, right? Not permitted by the law. And then number two, that in reality, how race conscious admissions operates is, I think, is a much more subtle, right, or kind of complex way, where in, kind of contemporary admissions, what it boils down to is really knowing, the ability to know what the race, ethnicity, like the full demographic background of the applicant is, and then being able to take that into consideration in not even necessarily like one singular way, right? It's not like, oh, now we're like bumping you up by this amount or something like that. It's to paint sort of a holistic picture, right? And so the term is often used, race conscious holistic admissions, where you're trying to understand an applicant, who they are, how race among many, many, many factors may have affected the educational opportunities they may have received, the experiences they may have had, K-12, et cetera, and then what they might potentially contribute to a student body, right? And basically what has been established is that race cannot be the determining factor. And, in the Harvard lawsuit, there are like many like pages, hundreds of pages of statisticians like facing off against each other to try to assess this question of, is Harvard like giving too much weight to race, right? And one of the, naturally Harvard's expert, but I think many external evaluators have also kind of looked through how they've crunched the numbers in different ways and have shown that any sort of benefit or attributed to race is actually low, quite low and quite modest, and is sort of like on par with like, I don't even know, like things that also have very kind of minimal or very limited impact. And so, but the public isn't always as interested in the nuance, and maybe academics, we certainly don't communicate it always very well. And so because of that, there's a lot of shorthand used, and sometimes misinformation can thrive when, a message that's easier to digest sometimes is like, oh, this is like being, this is just keeping certain groups out, or this is just giving certain groups a free ticket or a free ride, when in reality, it's really neither, right?
Hmm. I think you sort of bring a point here, and I'd love to bring in Art and Rachel on this topic. That sort of leads to our next question, which really centers on what makes affirmative action, in particular when it comes to higher education, so polarizing. So one Gallup poll, and I will preface that it is a few years old, so the perception on this topic may have changed over the last few years. But in terms of this particular poll, 60% of Americans favor affirmative action to some degree. But when it comes to higher education, that number drops significantly. And I'd be curious to see, with Art and Rachel here, why is that? What is it about higher education with affirmative action that somehow makes the concept so polarizing as opposed to something like employment?
I'll start on that one, and I'm not always sure actually that it's more polarizing or not in other contexts, right? Like it's affirmative action and contracting, people sort of complain about it a lot, those different things. I think this particular space, higher education, is a site of contest for a lot of partisan rhetoric right now. I think particularly in something that Julie mentioned is this concept of a preference being applied, and that somehow that preference means that it's also not a process about merit. And I think that that's a question that, again, with the sound bites that we get and the lack of nuance, some of the shorthand that we might use in the legal field or in scholarly fields, right, is part of that. But I also think it really strikes pretty deeply at a narrative that's tied to, in the US context, right, these ideas of individualism, of merit, of sort of where education sits in that space. And also I think this idea that we've come to a place where we actually, it's seen as bad to put this preference on there because it's perceived that we have an otherwise level playing field, right? Not recognizing that in fact, maybe we don't have a level playing field yet after sort of multiple centuries, right, of systemic distributions of benefits of the state and civil society kind of going to one group of individuals. And this is where you'd ask the question, right? Affirmative action as a public policy has done more for white women like myself, right? Like by the numbers, you can show it because it is part of that of breaking into these spaces. Higher education for the first several hundred years of this country were exclusively white men attending in most instances, right? There are some schools that were integrated. There were some schools that Black folks, Asian folks, Latinx folks, religious minorities had created on their own, some that had multiple genders, but actually the vast majority were not, right? And the vast majority were also getting public monies. So there's something really happening with this deep sort of narrative around how things are distributed that calls up this partisan rhetoric. I think there's also some things happening that just tie to Americanism in a particular way around these sort of notions of individualism, merit, what you do about past harms, right? So why should I, as a person who's coming up to this decision, I am innocent of these past harms. Why should I lose in this so-called, this perceived zero-sum game, lose out to someone who's getting this preference for something that I didn't even do, right? So there's a lot that's sort of tied into that I think makes it just a boiling point, right? A real major point of contestation. I don't know if Art has other ideas about that, but I think it goes deep. Right.
I would agree with you that it goes deep. There's a lot to unpack here. Let me hit a couple of points fairly quickly. I would not dispute sort of the notion that there is some partisanship associated with this, but I wouldn't overplay that hand. Forget polling for a second. Let's look at the votes in the 10 states, I think, that have voted on state voter bans with respect to public institutions. In 9 of those states, the bans passed with something approaching a 2/3, 1/3 split across the board in general terms. And so you've got sort of a pretty significant resistance to what is known as affirmative action in this context. And I think you got to pay attention to, I think the polling data shows people will value diversity. They will value the outcomes associated with diversity. But when you hear we're considering some preference or some element in an admissions process, that's where the pivot occurs. And in that particular context, I want to call out the nub of why I actually think what we should not be talking about the UNC and Harvard cases as affirmative action cases. Both Rachel and Julie have talked about sort of the remedial focus, Rachel talking about the employment distinctions between that and student admissions. Once Bakke pivoted and set the foundation for what we are fundamentally talking about today, it is not remedial, it is not equity-based, it is not social justice. It is very intentionally around the educational benefits of diversity, which is a research and institutional-based foundation to improve learning and outcome benefits for all students, not just students of color. So the concept is radically different, even though it's related, and there are overlapping principles to be sure. It is a very different concept than this original, quote unquote, affirmative action of the 1960s and 70s, which was sort of cast with a, it was not the scalpel, it was the heavy knife or the hatchet, if you will, with some very dramatic thumb on the scale kind of efforts to remedy the problems of discrimination that are still going on in America. This theory and this model is a finely polished scalpel in a very nuanced way, not looking at assumptions or stereotypes, but actually, to Julie's earlier point, looking at the actual applicant file case by case to see what is your lived experience? What are your interests that may be associated with that lived experience? What are your perspectives on issues that may be relevant to your higher education? And in that context, race enters the question. And I think that's a very different context than that more traditional and sort of broader brush, for contrast of the employment context that Rachel was talking about.
I want to, because I know we sort of mentioned particularly those two cases with like Harvard and UNC. And Julie, I'd love to bring you in on this particular conversation because a lot of it has sort of unfortunately sort of centered Asian Americans to some degree as like a focal point in the conversation. Can you sort of help us break down where that sort of originated from and where there are flaws in sort of centralizing one particular demographic with Asian Americans in these cases that SCOTUS will essentially bring to the forefront?
Sure. And I'll just give the disclosure that I served as a consulting expert on the SFFA v. Harvard case on the side of Harvard. And so anything I share here reflects only my own opinions and nothing learned through the course of that past engagement. But yes, in terms of how did Asian Americans come to become a big focal point in the Harvard lawsuit in particular? Well, it's no accident, right? It was actually a really intentional effort. And if I had my act together, I would like pivot and share my screen, but you can Google so basically recent litigation, like more recent litigation against trying to basically like wipe out race conscious admissions has really been mobilized by really kind of a one-man show with many funders and many different stakeholders involved. But I think the driving force has been a man named Edward Blum, and he was the one who organized the two University of Texas at Austin cases with the plaintiff Abigail Fisher. And I think after Fisher went to court, and the court ruled it upheld the Michigan cases, and then he tried again with Fisher too, kind of on another point. And Abigail Fisher was this white female with not exactly even like stellar grades. I mean, she's sort of in line with similar lawsuits that had been brought. And I think Ed Bloom finally realized that he needed to just change strategies. And so, he put up this website, which had a very not subtle, is like this picture of this Asian American female or male, maybe in different versions, and they're like studying and look really intense. And it's like, were you denied from Harvard? Like, it may be because you were the wrong race, right? And so you could tell who he was really looking for. And, Asian American kind of some angst around admissions and, the questions around like, oh, are Asian Americans being treated unfairly in admissions had been brewing, over some time. And there was a big blow up, around 2015 or 2016 in California, where there was really a lot of misinformation that ran rampant when there was some efforts in the state assembly to try to rescind Prop 209, the affirmative action ban in the state. And so around that time, there had been a portion, certainly not the entire, but there had been a portion of the Asian American community, in particular, I think more recent immigrants from mainland China, who I think maybe had varying levels of kind of understanding of some of like the historical reasons or race relations or reasons why kind of affirmative action or race conscious admissions policies had been adopted in the United States. And especially coming from a place where admissions, had been based in a very like one test score, and you come to the United States and it's like, oh, you're going to write an essay and we want to hear about your kids' clubs and all these other things that are like, what, right? And then on top of that, so you can see that kind of being this sector of the community that I think was very vulnerable to both a lot of misinformation. And so there were some research studies that I think were taken out of context that also kind of fed this myth that, and I have a book that has a whole chapter about this. And there is this myth that, Asian Americans had to have like a higher SAT score in order to get into elite colleges, when in reality that analysis didn't control or was very limited basically in scope. And even the author of it, a professor at Princeton, said like, this is not smoking gun evidence that, elite institutions discriminate against Asian Americans. But, there's this sector of the community that I think had a lot of angst. And unfortunately, this coincided during a period where admit rates at, very elite institutions were just going down in sort of that in ways that were, I think, alarming to many families. And so affirmative action or race conscious admissions became kind of this scapegoat for some Asian Americans. And so the time, unfortunately, for sort of a convergence of interests was very ripe. And so Ed Bloom, found this audience and some disgruntled Asian American families, and he mobilized them and created this group called SFFA, Students for Fair Admissions. And so there's like a chunk that's made up of Asian Americans for the Harvard lawsuit. And then also he has like a separate arm of them who mobilized in the UNC lawsuit. And so, yeah, it's, if you read the complaint that was originally filed, it's, in some ways we want to feel sympathetic towards these young people who, they're like, oh, I had, plaintiff had like a, almost perfect SAT score and had like perfect SAT 2 math and all of these things. And, volunteered for NPR and did all of these great things. And, on surface level, everyone's like, wow, like how could they have gotten rejected? But the reality is like thousands of students annually get, perfect SAT scores. Like I was not one of them, but they're out there evidently, and they're a decent number. And, it's like, oh, they're national merit semifinalists. Like that's great. But it's like, oh, there are about 16,000 of those annually. And Harvard's first year class is about 1,600 students or 1,400 or something very small. And so with that, I think, there are a lot of students of all races who aren't getting into like Harvard because just most students aren't getting into Harvard, period, over 95% now. And so there's a lot of just, I think, misunderstanding about how admissions works. But unfortunately, that kind of led to this moment where I think Asian Americans are being in some ways like taken advantage of. And then, other Asian Americans who are who know, certainly what they are doing and maybe are, we disagree on certain things. But I think it's really important to hammer home that we have national polling data that consistently shows that the majority of Asian Americans actually do support race-conscious admissions policies, and that about 40% of Asian Americans in higher education undergrads at any one point are enrolled in community colleges and not places like Harvard or even the UC system or, but they are there's a huge sector that are in the 2-year sector, and then also at large state institutions versus your Ivy League institution. So it's a complex story.
I'd love to pull in the other two panelists here to sort of continue this conversation with the ramifications of the SCOTUS decision here, because I know we've touched a little bit on sort of what the undergrad perspective might look like. But I'd really love to hear what sort of ramifications will the SCOTUS decision have on even things like grad school or med school or even law school. I'd love to start with you here. What are we anticipating here, and how do we sort of process this in terms of consequence for different demographics that may be wanting to further their education?
So I would say, for starters, wise people never predict what the Supreme Court is going to say. So I will start with that baseline. But what I will say, as someone who's been practicing law for way more decades than I can count in this space, that it is important to understand that even though the court is looking, and I think this is the way the briefs have been submitted, the way the record is developed, they're going to be looking at 2 undergraduate programs, sort of the 4 corners of admissions design. They're not going in, I would not expect them to go into issues of financial aid and scholarships in any central way, or recruitment and outreach, and I would not expect them to reach beyond the undergraduate level to go to your point, medical schools, law schools, graduate programs. But you'd have to be living under a rock not to recognize that the decision itself is highly likely to have some implications beyond the 4 corners of undergraduate admissions. And so the basic principles that the court articulates with respect to the undergraduate institutions is likely to be pretty central to how graduate medical law schools consider their admissions policies and programs. In fact, if you look at what the AAMC or other associations that lead the charge to help their members get this right, both educationally and legally do, you take the principles from the cases that have been decided and you figure out how it applies to you. So my favorite 2 words from Justice O'Connor and Grutter in 2003, context matters. It's not a cookie cutter, cut and paste, but it is an adaptation of those principles. And so I think you've got to think through the potential, in fact, the likelihood that whatever the court decides will have significant consequences in the admissions realm, whether you're an undergraduate institution or a graduate or medical or law school.
We can pass it over to Rachel here. Any additional thoughts that you may want to add?
No, other than just to affirm we don't have a decision yet. But I think to the point that Art's making, there's a lot of writing on the wall. The fact that even some of these are getting taken up, is that right, Art? I forget, like, it may not have even needed to come back up. I'm forgetting the way this sort of came, one of the cases.
So I think you're alluding to the UNC case. And so there's a process where you go to a trial court, the district court, and then you go to an appeal court. For Harvard, it was the First Circuit Court of Appeals. For UNC, it would be the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And then the Supreme Court has discretion to grant review in cases like this. It's called the writ of certiorari. In Harvard, it granted that writ, but SFFA attempted to get UNC heard at the same time. In fact, they attempted a consolidation, but the courts rejected it. But what the Supreme Court did was, in essence, allow SFFA to leapfrog over the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And so without an appellate review, the district court decision in the UNC case is being heard by the Supreme Court at the same time. The 2 cases are being heard basically side by side. So you've got that decision, and the notion that the court would be taking that kind of action to do nothing with respect to this sort of set of issues seems, I would say, unlikely. But I would also, like, let's be clear, courts surprise us every day.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to sit here and predict a particular outcome. And by the way, there's a range of outcomes here. Obviously, UNC and Harvard can prevail. By the way, they prevailed in every court proceeding below in significant, very lengthy and detailed and quite well analyzed, in my view, lower court opinions. But the court could say, oh, we think the lower court got it wrong on X, Y, or Z. It might be something as dramatic as, let's wipe out the entire doctrine that this court has lived by for 45 years. Or we think you missed a piece of evidence, and in the future, institutions should do this narrow thing. So, once again, the details, the actual decision by the court, the words of the court will matter a lot. From where I sit and the work I do, it's now for working with institutions to make sure institutions are thinking through the various scenarios by which a court could come down with a decision. You hope for the best, you prepare for the worst. And that's the work that should be going on now.
I want to talk a bit about the sort of influence affirmative action sort of had in dominating the conversation. Rachel, you and I had a pretty good conversation earlier on about some other areas that you sort of felt should also be in some of these conversations. We talked a little bit about legacies and athletics. How does that relate to inequities, perhaps in comparison to what affirmative action may or may not do?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just for that broader, and I think Julie was sort of hinting at some of this too, in terms of what else gets a bump, right? When we're looking at these things as we take up a holistic consideration. And even with some of these, some of the older cases, the research actually shows that things like a boost attached to joining an athletic team has more impact than, say, race, right? In who gets in out of that pool for highly selective organizations. In some institutions that are tuition dependent, but still somewhat selective, you'll also see ability to pay have a higher bump in terms of how you build a class that's broadly diverse on different elements. You might see something, and this is in particular, right? Legacy admissions. So people who have typically a direct, but sometimes indirect family member who have been to the institution before. And there's some reasons why admissions groups use that. You may also see a number of institutions, have lists for people who are donors to the institution. So there are a lot of different reasons outside of this, what I would say is still somewhat fraught conception of academic merit, right? There a lot of these cases, they really focus on the SAT scores or GPAs and those types of things. And as Julie mentioned, a lot of those scores are within a statistical realm of, is there really any difference in the amount of error where people are sort of getting cut off? So it really is dependent on the actual system. So I think that's one, just calling into question when and how do we put weight on these things that come into this process, and why not some things over other things. And I think that's where Art made the good point. We were talking about what is affirmative action as a policy. And I will say, as a person, right, I get to say this, I actually think that affirmative action as a restorative or reparative policy may still be a good thing and may still be needed, right, in the way I sort of look at things. So separate from what Art was so rightly talking about, that fundamentally the premise of what is happening here has changed to the benefits of diversity, where there is actually, I think, still a place for taking into consideration that, especially in education, after Brown v. Board, I live in a massive resistance state here, and I've grown up my entire life in Virginia, where my father actually was one of the first white students to integrate a Black school in the 60s, right? So I think there's still a place for it, and I think that there's a broader conversation kind of looking at, you can't just take up affirmative action kind of alone. You really might want to put it in context with some broader policies that are happening in education in relation to public funding or declines in public funding of higher education. So Julie mentioned a lot of these institutions, even public ones, are highly selective or highly rejective, whichever way you want to sort of frame it, right? And part of that is because we're not being asked as a point of public policy to expand affordable seats exactly at some of these flagship institutions, right? We're being asked to do something else. So I think there's actually a lot to be looking at and sort of broadening that narrative of how do we see this one tool sitting with lots of others, and what sort of gets lifted up as legitimate for what you might factor in or consider. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's a lot bigger than this one kind of thing.
We've got a couple of questions coming in, but I do want to stay here because I think you sort of lead into a broader point, and I'd love to pull Julie's perspective in on this as well, which is sort of part of the conversation with racial inequity in higher education, like you sort of alluded to, is just the college affordability. And a lot of times the economic factors of what equitable college access looks like, that economy side kind of gets left out of the conversation. Why do you all feel it's important for us to not lose sight of why the economic factors are just as important when you are considering college affordability, what it means to admit a particular student? What does it look like to make sure these things are not left out? I can pass over to Julie, and then Rachel and Art, if you had any thoughts, we could hand it over to you as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think social classes and economic background is essential to look at and is really important, and it shapes so many parts of students' lives and the opportunities they're able to have. I think it's really just important to keep the conversation as race and class together, right? And not to make it sort of an either or discussion. I think you know, we have some interesting research that shows that we can maximize not just racial diversity, but also economic diversity when we look at both race and class together versus only looking at SES in isolation. And that's because in this country, we have not just an economic gap, we have a racial wealth gap, right? Where racial inequality and economic inequality are layered on top of each other. And so I think within the admissions sphere, it's really critical for admissions practitioners and for institutions to continue to, to use policies in ways that are keeping an eye on both. I think sometimes where it's, and it's really fascinating how certain programs that you would think, oh, well, if we just put the focus on class, then we're gonna, I think the public or even higher ed administrators commonly think, oh, if we have sort of more aggressive class oriented policies, we're gonna take up, it's like a twofer, right? And we're gonna be able to buy one, get one, and be able to take care of all of our problems. But unfortunately that usually doesn't happen. And it's really interesting to see some of the nuances, within higher ed. So for instance, there are like loan reduction programs or sort of free tuition programs that have become increasingly popular at state institutions. But there are some interesting studies that have indicated that while these programs are linked to higher, say, Pell Grant recipient enrollment, they're not necessarily always linked to higher underrepresented, racially minoritized student enrollment. And so that's it's complicated and interesting in different ways. And so I think it's really important just for both practitioners and policies makers to be understanding, how race and class are constantly influencing each other and how you need sort of these multifaceted policies in order to be able to maximize both opportunity and also to facilitate the educational benefits of diversity. I think what we've also found though from the past though is that if you're not intentional about race, you're not going to get you're going to miss a lot. And so you're not going to get that, buy one, get one. It's not that simple.
We do have a question here, and it sounds as though Art, it may be presented to you. So earlier on, we talked a lot about what hypothetical consequences could look like to the Supreme Court case decision. The question is really asking, perhaps in a hypothetical scenario, are there any positive consequences that could potentially sort of be brought to fruition from the court case decision?
Well, again, not predicting what an outcome is going to be, I will tell you it is certainly the mere fact of these cases has galvanized attention. And so you have a focus on this set of issues at a really remarkable time where we've got so much lifting up, so much information that lifts up, as I think Rachel alluded to earlier, the ongoing racial gaps and issues that we are addressing as a country. And it's raising a new sort of, how does this all play? My hope is we could get beyond the bumper stickers and the mythology of so much what has been out there to really address it in a more meaningful way. But I would say, to the extent it's casting a light on it, that's a good thing in my view. I think it means that institutions are hopefully charged and looking hard again at what they're doing to meet their goals. At the end of the day, I want to come back to sort of a theme I've been driving. This is about a policy design to achieve a mission for a particular institution and what it values. And there will be issues associated with racial and ethnic diversity. There will be issues associated with income. but there will be issues associated with dozens of other factors and interests that go into making an institution an institution. And this is not, I want to be really clear, this is not numbers for numbers' sake. It might have been in the 60s and 70s. It is not in 2022 numbers for numbers' sake, at least based on my experience and the research I've seen. It is about creating a baseline of compositional diversity so that you've got a baseline for student experience and student growth and student learning, where students all feel welcome and included and not isolated because they're one of 500 who walk into a room and happen to be a person of color. There's a psychology and a social science behind this. And that evidence shows, Julie can speak to this better than I can, that when you've got that kind of learning environment for the benefit of all students, again, that leads to better educational, professional, and civic outcomes. Like, we've got decades of data on this. And so my frustration is actually on this term we've heard a lot in the last hour, the mythology of what's really going on. Because if you actually go behind closed doors, as I have for decades with admissions officers, and understand the nuance here, this is not, let me accept that student because of their race. They are looking at the individual applicant to see, what are your interests? What's your lived experience? What might I be missing through some other data like test scores and grades that I need to understand to figure out how to value you and your application in light of my particular mission?
I think that sort of encapsulates where we can sort of land the plane here with our final question, and I can pass the baton off to our two panelists to sort of close us out here. In addition to some of the thoughts that Art has alluded to here, where do we go from here in light of a deeper understanding of this conversation, and what would be your advice for higher ed institutions when it comes to what should we be considering if we are looking to sort of close that gap of racial inequity in both admissions and in retention at our institutions?
I'll let you go first, Julie. And then maybe
Okay, sure. Let's see here. For deeper reading or understanding, let's see here. I know it's like the end of the day, and so lagging a little bit. Well, I have a book out. It's called Race on Campus, Debunking Myths with Data. So pure self-interest, self-promotion. And so it's written in a conversational style, but brings together all of that social science research, some of which that Art just alluded to kind of tackle some of the different big questions around admissions in particular, and then also the campus racial climate. And so there's a chapter on, why can't we just consider a class instead of race in race conscious admissions or in admissions policies. There's a chapter on the Harvard lawsuit in particular, and how Asian Americans, I argue, actually benefit from affirmative action and race conscious admissions based policies. So that's one. There's so many great scholars and researchers who are doing work on this, Liliana Garces, Oyan Poon, and others. I would, for deeper reading, I would, amicus briefs, I think, are either they're up, I think, and you could, if you really want to get a deep dive, I think, into the lawsuits, you could read. So amicus briefs are friend of the court briefs, and they are filed by different parties who have something to say about that they want the court to hear about why this issue matters to them. And so it's always really fascinating to read, the very diverse range. In the Michigan cases, you had like retired US Army generals who filed a brief. You had MTV filed a brief. You have different coalitions of undergraduate or graduate student groups file briefs. And so I think that would be a great place to learn more about the case. And you can read those who are, people file briefs on both sides. So there'll be people who file briefs in support of SFFA, and there will be people who support briefs, who file briefs in support of both Harvard and UNC. And so that's another, I think, interesting place. And, there's a new kind of up and coming economist, scholar named Zach Bleemer. And I was actually just reading he like posts some summaries of his research on Twitter. And so I was reading one on like the long-term effects of Prop 209 on like economic mobility in California. And so I think that's another great place. Dominique Baker, she's another one, just really great, important, cutting edge research that's being done out there. So yeah, there's so much to read.
And I think, Adrian, you have a couple that folks will get. Mine may look a little bit different, sort of streaming folks from the critical race theory space and thinking about affirmative action and going back, looking recently, but going back to some of the earlier contestations. I would actually say something that Art said is really, I think, powerful, which is going back to a lot of institutions and practitioners just need to pay a lot more attention, be really thoughtful, actually be intentional and sort of understanding what it is we're doing and why, and how that relates to our missions, and really being strong in our sort of values and our statements, right, of why are we doing this thing, to really take that seriously and looking at it. But I think also, for individuals, a lot of it, and Art mentioned this too, we have polling data, but then there's also the voting data. And I think there is nothing around what this means in terms of wherever you sit on the issue, depending on what the court comes down with, there may be opportunities to mobilize and be engaged as voters with, for the policy in this space, depending on where you are. So I think there's activity. I don't think it's going to be done with us yet. I don't think the argument will end here, no matter which way it sort of lands.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for your time, your effort, your energy into this conversation. We want to encourage you all to continue this conversation with your friends and your colleagues. A lot of the resources that were mentioned towards the end of this panel will be sent to you in an email. If you're looking to continue hearing more about this conversation, later on in the semester, we'll be having a part 2 with this conversation, but they will be people within our own Towson community. And so if you are interested in sort of seeing how this topic is sort of contextualized to the Towson University experience, be sure to be on the lookout for when that will be uploaded on our Office of Inclusion's YouTube page. With that being said, we want to thank you all so much for being here in attendance. Once again, my name is Adrian Battle Marston, and good luck for you all in the rest of the semester. And again, thank you all for the panelists.